I was exactly the right person for the job because of this FIRE formula, which is marrying your abilities, your values, and your desires. Mm-hmm. And so for me in 2012, when I had young children, my values were protecting my family and my community. My abilities were the communications skills that I had perfected over a decade. And my desire was to be part of a badass army of women that was going to take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. So fire starters, that's who I talk about a lot in the book. I interview over 70 women. It's just a woman who has decided to put their desires over their obligations.
Mm-hmm. Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Dr. Anna-Malika Tubbs. I'm a sociologist and the author of 2 books titled The Three Mothers and Erased. Tonight, I'll be talking with Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action and author of the new book, Fired Up. Now, let me tell you more about Shannon. Shannon Watts is the founder of Moms Demand Action, the largest grassroots group fighting gun violence in the United States. Known as the summoner of women's audacity, she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, a Forbes 50 over 50 changemaker, and a Glamour Woman of the Year. Her new book is titled Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. And as of today, and I am so excited to be the first to be able to say this, it is officially an instant New York Times bestseller. So Shannon, I am so honored to be in conversation with you. You are such an inspiration to me. So thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to be here with you. Let's start off by asking, you have been a powerful changemaker for years, and you've inspired countless people to find their own passions and to step into their power. And I want to hear why you wanted to translate these experiences into writing. This is not your first book. This is your second book. Your first book came out in 2019. And so I'm curious how writing is an extension of your activism, an extension of your powerful work. What does it allow you to do, and how do you see it as a tool to advance already this incredible impact you have in the world?
Well, thank you also for being here today. I admire you so much, and you're such a good friend and colleague, and I'm just so grateful to have this conversation with you tonight. And your books are amazing. You know, I have always wanted to be a writer. That's actually what I thought I would do. I was strangely obsessed, and maybe this is my ADHD, but I was strangely obsessed with Watergate as a child. Mm-hmm. My very first sentence was, "Nixon lied to the people." My parents insist that was my first sentence. And then they bought me this old-fashioned typewriter, and I would start writing these novels or these biographies about people, and that's really what I thought I would end up doing. I wanted to be like a woman, Woodward and Bernstein. And the same reason I wanted to write and go down rabbit holes, my ADHD really kept me from graduating from journalism school. It was a real struggle for me going through high school and through college. And even though I went to University of Missouri to become a journalist, I ended up, after graduating, becoming a communications specialist. But writing was always my first love. And I talk in the book about how I found myself at a crossroads in my late 30s. I was in a marriage that wasn't working for me. I was in a career I didn't love because I wasn't a journalist. And I went to the emergency room because I was covered in eczema, head to toe. And it was a moment for me where I realized I was going to have to start doing things differently because the doctor said it was caused in part because I was not facing these things in my life that were causing me such stress. And I couldn't afford a therapist, couldn't confide in my husband because my marriage was a part of the issue, and I just sort of wrote my way out of it, right? My journal became a roadmap for what I wanted my future to look like. And as I talk about in the book, I did end up leaving my marriage and my job, but when I started Moms Demand Action, it was my writing, my communication skills, my ability to tell a story, because at the end of the day, as you know, activism really is storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
That helped me start Moms Demand Action. And what I found was that volunteers kept saying to me, how did you do this? I want to do this too, but maybe in my neighborhood or my community or my state. Not necessarily a huge national organization and not necessarily about gun violence prevention. So that first book, which is called Fight Like a Mother, was really meant to be a manual, very much explaining how we started Moms Demand Action, how it became successful, how we kept it going, and how we won in activism. And so I did Moms Demand Action for 11 years, and at the very end, I thought I was going to take a break, and I got a call from Maria Shriver, who said, I have a book in print I would love for you to write for me. Write a book. And I said, well, what about? And she said, what have you learned about women? I was like, well, that could be, a trilogy. And it was just an amazing process. I know we'll talk more about that, but I think it's so important to capture when you're in organizing how you did it and how it works, especially when it's the first of its kind, like Moms Demand Action.
Absolutely. And I think especially as women, we're often told not to tell that story. We're often told kind of stay in the background, and we don't leave a record of how we did it. And it's so powerful that you are able to express that, to allow other people to do it. It's not for you to just celebrate what you've done. It's entirely about how do we get more people to be able to do this. And I'm always so inspired by that. So with this in mind, this book is filled with such a beautiful sense of power and urgency in all of the language that it employs. So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about the title and the key words and this thoughtful metaphor. Why fired up? Why live on fire? Why are these words so important for all the people that we know, you know, or that don't even know you yet? Why is it so important for people to embody this fire? But especially, why is it important for women to do so?
So after Maria suggested I write this book, I had to spend a lot of time thinking about what I was going to narrow it down to and what I had learned about working with women in my career and my activism. And so I gathered all the books that I loved, and a lot of them were sort of self-help or empowerment books, and I took them to a friend's house who is a pretty famous author. And she looked at me and said, these are incredibly boring books that you brought me, and you are a very fiery personality. And when she said that, I realized that was who I was, right? That this saying of you have to fight fire with fire. And I have always felt like, rising to the occasion is what's called for, particularly for women, when you're taking on, for example, gun extremists. And so the premise of the book really is what I have seen is that so often men are taught to fulfill their desires and women are taught to fulfill their obligations. And I think the opposite of those obligations and all of those shoulds is fire. And the metaphor, living on fire, is looking at two things: what's limiting you and what's calling you. And we can talk more about the formula, but what happened for me in order to live on fire, and I think, we've all been sold this idea that you're born for a purpose and you're supposed to be focusing on what it is you were born to do. I actually think it's more about fulfillment, living on purpose instead of for a purpose, and that those fires last throughout your life, and they might be big and they might be small. And for me, what happened was when I started Moms Demand Action, just to be clear, as I mentioned, I had severe untreated ADHD. I also had a debilitating fear of public speaking. I knew little to nothing about gun violence organizing or the legislative process. So not really someone people pointed at and said, that woman should take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. And yet I was exactly the right person for the job because of this FIRE formula, which is marrying your abilities, your values, and your desires. And so for me in 2012, when I had young children, my values were protecting my family and my community. My abilities were the communications skills that I had perfected over a decade. And my desire was to be part of a badass army of women that was going to take on the most powerful, wealthy special interest that's ever existed. So fire starters, that's who I talk about a lot in the book. I interview over 70 women. It's just a woman who has decided to put their desires over their obligations.
When you're putting together a formula like this, at what point do you realize that's the language that you can retrospectively say, that's what was happening in my life? When did you find the language for it? Because in the moment, you might not realize that's what it was, that was the desire, that was, in the book you talk about what's your fuel, et cetera.
Yep.
So I'm curious, in your experience, when in this writing process did you realize those are the words? That's what it always was.
Yeah, I mean, I did not know it at the time. I started Moms Demand Action when I was 41 years old, and it felt like alchemy. It felt like magic. It felt like touching the divine. Yeah. Because I was standing shoulder to shoulder with these other activists, and we were making progress. We were stopping bad bills. We were passing good bills. We were electing our own volunteers to office. And it was because we all brought those values, skills, and desires to the table. And for everyone, they're different, right? And I then held the hand of thousands of other women who did the exact same thing. And that doesn't mean... It can be personal, professional, or political. It doesn't mean that you become an activist. It doesn't mean you start an organization or a company. It can mean a tough conversation. For many of the women I interviewed, the FIRE formula meant for them, they were able to extract themselves from a difficult relationship, or they were able to ask for a promotion. It can be small things depending on what that is. But when the FIRE metaphor, that came first, we started to talk about, well, what is the formula for fire in real life, right? And it's, heat, oxygen, fuel. And those three sides became the perfect metaphor for living on fire in real life.
That's so beautiful. And you started to talk about it a little bit, some of the vulnerable parts of your own story that you share with your readers in the book. And it feels like such an invitation for us as the readers and your audience to be vulnerable as well. I want to talk about that vulnerability and the challenges that you faced
in being vulnerable. Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The challenges of saying, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable in this book. I'm going to put my story out there. I'm going to talk about how I was struggling through a marriage, how I had this physical manifestation of stress. Was that difficult to do? Or was it something that you felt was necessary, or both? I just want to hear about that process.
It was so difficult. I think, first of all, I'm a pretty stoic person. I think the reason I could take on the gun lobby and not back down but double down was because I can put on this facade. Because everybody's vulnerable at their core, right? But I could be externally tough.
Right.
And that has always been my personality. And I knew that writing this book would require a vulnerability that would be very uncomfortable for me. Because I do need to be seen, at least I did for 11 years, as the face of this organization. And to be vulnerable was to invite blowback from gun extremists, right? Who would take anything you say and use it against you, and did many times. And so I had to be very careful about what I said. I had to make sure volunteers didn't see me as being afraid, because then they would be afraid. And so I became the tip of the spear. And I think that I absorbed that so totally that it was very difficult for me when it came time to write the book to take that armor off. And, I would write and I would keep getting these notes from my writing coach that were like, yeah, no, this is not vulnerable enough. You're not sharing enough of who you are. Wow. And so I finally, by the end of the book writing process, felt like, oh, what do you want to know about me? I'll tell you anything. But at the beginning, it was difficult.
How did you get there? How did that transition happen?
I think that it takes loosening it up. It takes getting some of those stories out and being comfortable with them, being out in the world. I would have my husband read it. But also the fact that I had stepped away from Moms Demand Action was sort of a newfound freedom too, that I could be a different person, that I didn't have to be the tip of the spear, and that I could be a person who had taken this journey, and that the journey wasn't linear, and that I was not, this perfect leader, that I was a human being like everybody else.
Wow. That kind of gets us into thinking about some of the challenges that you've had to face, and how you are willing to share those with your audience in this book, so that we feel like if we come up against these challenges, we know what to do in response to that. So I'd love if you could tell our audience who maybe hasn't read the book yet, what were some of the early challenges you faced in trying to find your fire, and trying to live on fire, what are some of the challenges you face when you're trying to sustain that fire? Because you make it clear in the book that maybe when you start to live on fire, there are going to be moments where that fire is starting to wane a little bit. And how do we face those challenges as well? So if you could just tell us some of the challenges, some of the barriers that you faced.
Well, the first is, and I think some of these things are specific to women, is taking that first step. And a lot of the reason women don't is because we all fear blowback, right? And we don't fear our fire because we're weak, it's because we're wise. We know that the system is set up to put obstacles in front of us every step of our way. I mean, imagine if women woke up every day and asked themselves, what do I want? Before doing all the things that we were supposed to do.
Right.
Institutions would topple, governments would fail, family systems would fall apart, right? And there's a reason for that, because that is that keeps the system going. And I want to shift that paradigm. And so this is in many ways a handbook about the blowback that you can expect when you live on fire. All of it is predictable, none of it is personal. And there are just feelings of guilt and shame that living differently creates. And some of those are external from society. Some of those are internal. I interview someone named Eve Rodsky, if you've read the book Fair Play. She talks about women being CIYOO, complicit in your own oppression. This idea that we start to internalize our shoulds and our obligations, and we start to think they're actually our desires. And so the blowback that can happen, I call them extinguishers in the book, when you feel guilt and shame, you want to disappear, you have imposter syndrome, perfectionism, a fear of failure. There's all these different things that I write about in the book and the stories of the women that have gone through them. But I do think that our ability to live on fire is directly proportional to the amount of blowback that we can withstand. And so I talk in the book about how you can reframe the blowback and actually start to enjoy fanning the flames, right? Which I did. When I first started Moms Demand Action, the threats of death and sexual violence were immediate to me and my family. And I tell the story in the book about how I was living in Indiana and I called the police to come by the house because people were driving by my house. And I told him the story and he said, well, that's what you get when you mess with the Second Amendment, ma'am.
Oh, no.
And so that was, I just knew, that if I lost my children, I had nothing left to lose. So the blowback was something I was going to endure. But I go through a lot of exercises and a lot of journal prompts in the book. But it comes down to, first of all, assessing who the criticism is from, right? I had so many people telling me I wasn't the right person. It couldn't be done. It had already been done. We wouldn't win. All these reasons why I shouldn't do this. And then, of course, all the criticism that came from gun extremists. And so you have to assess the criticism and who is giving it and deciding whether you value it or not. Right. And that we can't just, take everyone's criticism internally and believe that it is true. The other thing is to reframe the criticism. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. I talked to Sharon Salzberg, the Buddhist meditation expert, and I talked to Kristen Neff, who is an expert on self-compassion, just ways to reframe the blowback in your mind. And then finally, to remember that we're all role models, right? So our kids are watching us. If we have kids, other women are watching us, other people are watching us. And so it's a virtuous circle that when we are able to endure the blowback and keep going no matter what, it empowers other people to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us about a time when you maybe felt that your fire was starting to extinguish? Or have you ever had to rekindle the fire?
Yeah. Certainly when you are doing this work as a full-time volunteer for 11 years, 7 days a week, at all hours of the day, your vacations are always interrupted by horrific shooting tragedies. It becomes, it's vicarious trauma, right? And the burnout, not just among volunteers, but obviously survivors, even more importantly, is very real. And so there were a lot of times when maybe I was overwhelmed by family matters. I have a kid who I've written about, with her permission, had an eating disorder that was very severe. And there were times that I would have to come back from a trip or cancel my work, which I felt guilty about as a woman, that I would have to give my work to someone else. But also that, in those early days especially, it was overwhelming. I went from being a stay-at-home mom for 5 years to being busier than I had ever been in my career.
Yeah.
And, there were threats, and it was a lot. And it just felt a lot of times like the obstacles were removed. I tell the story about, we had a Facebook page, a national Facebook page, and we would tell the stories of gun violence survivors, and it became overridden by trolls. And I was in charge of the Facebook page in those early days, and I would spend hours and hours deleting and blocking people. And a woman called me and said, I live in Indiana. I saw that you have all these trolls on your page. I'm disabled, and I'm home all day, and if you give me your passwords, I will delete all those trolls. And she did it for 7 years.
What a blessing.
Yes. So yes, there were plenty of times that I began to feel like I couldn't do it, but it was always rekindled by the inspiration of community, the bonfire of women, as I refer to it. Yeah. But I also think, and we can talk about this too, but I do think fires should be finite, power should be finite. And so I also knew always that this wasn't something I was going to do forever.
Yeah, yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why should it be finite? Because we're so often taught to focus on maybe one goal and really fulfill that goal. And instead, in this book, you're telling us this is a rebirth. You are constantly rediscovering things about yourself, or finding new passions, or just really listening to yourself at any given point. And so why is that important to give that message versus the finite one?
Yeah, I think that, the fire cycle is constant rebirth and death. And that should be throughout your life, right? You should feel like you got to the end of your life and that you burned. And I think that the archetype for this book, young women just out of high school or college, young women who feel overwhelmed by careers or family, women who are empty nesters like me who suddenly have all this time on their hands to do more that they wanted to do, or women who are retired, in their 60s and beyond, who have all this wisdom to bring. And I just think we should look at it as a constant cycle. In my mother's generation, after I left home, she was seen as obsolete, that she was somehow supposed to step back from society. And we hear a lot of stories right now about what women are doing, and they're very inspiring. But I thought it was important to talk about the how. How are they doing it? But really quickly back to the power piece, which I think is very relevant given where we are right now in this country, especially with Congress. Yeah. I don't think people should hoard power. And sometimes we have the scarcity mindset, as though we finally figured out what our fire was and we want to do it and we're never going to let it go. And so I began to ask myself every year, is this the year I step back? Knowing that the only way the organization would last into perpetuity was to have new energy and new ideas. And there's a woman, and I think she's probably in the audience, who said to me at the very beginning of Moms Demand Action, whatever you do, don't get founder syndrome. And I said, of course not. And then I hung up the phone and had to Google what founder syndrome was. And it's this idea that if you found something, your ego can become so enmeshed in it that it either fails when you leave or you want to burn it down because you don't want it to succeed without you. And so when it was in 2022, I was standing in the Rose Garden as President Biden signed the first Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first gun safety legislation and generation into law, that I felt an inner knowing of, this is the bookend to my activism.
Wow. And was that hard?
Was it hard to let go of my identity for 11 years?
Yeah,
it was. There was a lot of suffering, but I knew there would be, and I was prepared for it. And I have a good therapist and my husband and friends, but I also knew that was what was best for the organization.
Yeah. Wow. So you've mentioned a couple different names and different women, different people who either stepped in and said, I'm going to help you with this part so that you can keep going, or who just said, even friends who said, don't write that. You're somebody who is a fiery personality. So I see you as somebody who champions other people. You especially really elevate the stories of other women. You mentor other women, you support other women. And I've experienced this personally. You've always been in my corner. You've shared my books. You've always asked me, how can I help get the word out? And so I'm just inspired by the way you uplift others. And in this book, you do that again. This book is filled with stories of other people who you refer to as fire starters. And I wanted to ask why this approach is so important to you. What is it about sharing the stories of other people that drives you? And in addition to that, how did you go about collecting all of these incredible stories for this book?
I have always been a very passionate feminist. I can remember my dad gave me a T-shirt when I was 9, and it said, "Girls can do anything boys can do." And it wasn't something I was excited to have, because my thought was, holy shit, there are people that think girls can't do what boys can do. Like, that was a realization. It was the first time I ever realized that. Cool. And so I really have dedicated my life to, as you said, summoning the audacity of other women. And that's what I realized as a gun safety champion, that was a fire in my life, but the theme that runs through it is a desire to lift up other women and help them see that they have so much power and ability and talent. And telling stories, I think, we were talking about activism being about storytelling. I mean, this is a form of activism to show other people examples of women who, no matter what their age was, no matter, where they came from, that they could achieve something, or that they could follow their desires. And I'll just tell you quickly a couple of the stories from the book that inspire me. I talked to Amber Goodwin, who graduated from college, tried to get into law school, applied to like over a dozen, didn't get in. When Donald Trump became president, she was like, I sure as hell deserve to be in law school. She applied again at 40, became the first Black woman to ever be the president of her law school, and now her fire is helping other women of color across the country get into law schools.
Amazing.
I talked to a woman who was a single mom, who didn't have a college education, who became enmeshed in the school system because her son had difficulties in school, and was so familiar with the school system that she eventually became the president of the school board, and then became the first Black woman president ever of the PTA, the national PTA, right? So there's just all these amazing stories of how women found their fire and how they used it to uplift other people. And I think those stories help us understand how we can do the same thing.
Absolutely. And can you tell us about the process of that? How do you decide on the stories that you're going to include? How do you interview the people that you're going to include? And was there any pushback from anybody saying, I don't know if I want to be featured in the book, or were people excited to share their story?
People were excited. Because I have been connected to so many women through Moms Demand Action, then I could start saying, these are the kind of stories that I'm looking for, and people would tell me. I was talking to one woman that I thought would be in the book, a Moms Demand Action volunteer, and she started talking about her mother. And it's funny because I was in Charleston, South Carolina this week, and this woman who's in the book, her name is Bridget Sloan, and she was raised in Cleveland. And she always wanted to have her own arts and crafts business. And she got waylaid by having 5 children and working. And now she's in her 70s and has a business on Etsy making hats for women, Black women's hair. And she came up to the event in Charleston and she said, I'm on page 90. And then she came up and sat in my chair and read her whole passage out loud to the audience. It was wonderful. But the stories, some of them were stories I was searching for, but some of them just came to me. And honestly, it was just 70 women. I think it could have been hundreds and hundreds. The stories of women are amazing and they deserve to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. You are always such an incredible ally as well. And many people have reference this. Of course, in your work against gun violence, you interact with many Black women who are grieving the loss of their children and or in their communities have seen rampant gun violence. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about the importance of that allyship, the importance of calling, white women into the conversation that often sometimes they can ignore. Yeah. And I think another example of that was when Vice President Kamala Harris entered the race. Yeah. And you again said, this is the time for us to come together, be allies to each other, walk next to each other in these journeys. So I just would love to hear, because it's something that a lot of people struggle with, figuring out how to be the best ally.
And it was a struggle. I don't want to act like I came to this fully formed. I was this amazing, heroic activist. I wasn't. I got involved in gun violence because I was afraid my kids were not safe in their schools. I was a white suburban mom, and I started Moms Demand Action thinking that this was really about mass shootings and school shootings. And what you learn when you come to the issue is that gun violence, the mass shootings are about 5% of gun violence in this country, less than that even. and that really it is the day-to-day gun violence with handguns, often in city centers, that is killing over 120 people in America every single day. And it was by the grace of many mentors pointing out to me how we could be better and do better that helped, I give myself credit for being open-minded and listening and learning, but it really was these women who, out of the goodness of their heart, helped me understand. One of my mentors who I was just with in Atlanta on a book event is Lucy McBath. Lucy was living in Atlanta, and her son, Jordan Davis, who was 17 years old, a black teenager, was shot and killed by a white man at a gun station who thought the music in his car was too loud. This was just weeks before the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy. And Lucy and I were connected. And she became a spokeswoman, and then she became a colleague, and now she's a congresswoman for over 6 years. But she was the one who would come to me and say, I appreciate this platform, but I notice that when I go out and speak, I'm talking to mostly white women, and we have to figure out how to bring more black women in particular in as volunteers, as leaders, and make sure that our policy is holistic and that we aren't just focusing on mass shootings and school shootings. So it was absolutely a journey, and I've been so honored to be on that journey. And then when Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, I, thanks to menopause, was up at 3 a.m. and I had seen black women and then black men have these calls where they raised over $1 million for Kamala Harris. And I just said, when are white women going to have a call like that? And I became the de facto organizer of said call. And it was 3 days. We had 3 days. And we had the most people ever in history on our Zoom. I think it was like 210,000 people. Yeah. And we raised $11 million in 2 hours. It was very amazing. And look, the white women clearly did not en masse vote the way that we had hoped in this election, but the silver lining, and we have to take our wins where we can get them, is that college-educated white women outperformed Biden for Harris by 5 points, right? So to me, that gives me hope that we can keep having these conversations, that we can get to a point where it's more of a community and less of a division.
Yeah. You showed and you show over and over again in these answers, but also in the book, that you often have ideas. You have a question. Why hasn't somebody done that? And then you do it. And so for our audience members, there's probably many times where we think, why hasn't somebody done that? Or somebody needs to do that. How do you translate that question into, okay, I'm going to be the one who does it? But also, how do you sometimes say, I'm not going to be the one who does that? Or does that ever happen? Are you always the one who does it?
I think that I trust my gut. When I started Moms Demand Action, I knew intuitively, having been so inspired as a teen in the 80s by Mothers Against Drunk Driving, that it was time for a Mothers Against Drunk Driving for gun safety. I just knew it. And when the Kamala Harris call happened, I knew, intuitively that was the right moment. But I also think that for whatever reason, I do not believe that all my T's have to be crossed and all my I's have to be dotted to get started on something. That has come with age and with wisdom, but that is the gating factor for so many women. If I had waited till I knew everything there was to know about gun violence, legislative process, organizing, I still wouldn't have started Moms Demand Action. I would still be figuring it out. And I think often I see women who are so brilliant and they have such great ideas. And I tell these stories in the book of some of the women who still haven't done the thing they want to do because that fear is holding them back. Like, what if I fail? What if it doesn't happen? And I think this idea of failing forward, and we called it losing forward at Moms Demand Action, like, you are always going to fail when you take on a powerful special interest. But if you give up every time you fail, you're never going to win. So how would we reframe that to this idea of what did you learn by losing? Maybe you grew your chapter. Maybe you have more relationships with lawmakers now. What did you learn to win the next time? And so I do think women have to be more willing to fail.
Yeah. Where do you think this fear of failure comes from for women? Because I know, obviously, in the book, you talk a lot about the system of patriarchy, something that you and I both talk a lot about. Yes. But yeah, when is it in women's lives that this fear of failing starts to kind of take hold of our ambitions, in your opinion?
I mean, I think that it's the way we're socialized, right? Men as boys are often socialized to take risks, and they're still celebrated when they fail. I talk about in the book, like even now, good guys like Beto O'Rourke or bad guys like Elon Musk, they fail spectacularly and they still continue to succeed and get new opportunities. I tell the story in the book of a woman named Becca De Felice, one of only a handful of Asian American women to ever run for state office in Texas. And she ran twice and she failed twice. And she said, people wanted me to disappear. They told me that, that I should just kind of like go back to the sidelines because I was this living, breathing example of what happens when women try and they fail. And instead of disappearing, what she ultimately did was to take her experience of losing when she ran for office, and now she runs Emerge Texas, and she helps train other women to run for office and to know what they can expect when they fail, when they lose. And so some of it is socialization, and we just don't even realize that fear we feel is a fear of failure.
To follow with that, so the subtitle of this book is How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. And you speak about how it is never too late for us to start living on fire. But just for a moment, I want us to think about our earliest stages of life, since we were just starting to talk about that socialization. Because in addition to your inspiring career, you're also a mother of 5 kiddos. Well, not kiddos anymore, but I call us our kiddos for the rest of their lives. And I am a mother, of 3 young children. And so I'm curious, do we come into the world as fire starters? Does that fire somehow get extinguished? Because in my opinion, kids so often know better than adults do on many different things. Or are we all born on a journey to find that fire from the beginning? And I also want to know how adults play a role in either helping children to maintain or discover that fire, that fuel, and avoid becoming extinguishers.
Yeah, I want to hear what you have to say too, as an expert on motherhood and the patriarchy. But, when I interviewed these 70 women, I asked them all what they were afraid their deathbed regret would be. And the most common deathbed regret is actually that I didn't live a life that was authentic to me. But what these women, almost all of them said, those who had children, and almost all of them did, was that they were afraid that if they pursued what they wanted, it would be at the expense of their children. That somehow they would be a bad mother if they spent time on themselves and what they wanted. And the actual opposite is true, and I talked to a lot of experts in the book. And I can tell you this firsthand, having been on the other side of that. My youngest is 25 now. There's 2 things. One is when you pursue something that's important to you, it takes the pressure off your kids. Because if your kids are your whole life, that is a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that you're setting an example for them. My kids don't say, because I did travel a lot when I started Moms Do Men Action, or actually the whole decade. My kids don't say, I can't believe you didn't go to that soccer game in 2006. They say, thank you for setting an example for me for how I can live. So I do think we have to remember that we want our kids to live the way that we're setting an example for them, and we then have to do those things so they see that. But I'm interested in what you think about that.
I completely agree with you. I think that we often are told as mothers that the more you sacrifice yourself, the better you are as a parent, that the more you deny yourself, that's how you can better love your children. But that is just a message we're being sold in order for women to feel that they can no longer reach their potential if they want to be mothers. Versus, if I think about my own mom, she was still so dedicated to her passion and to her work. And I think even for moms who are working within the home, often referred to as stay-at-home moms, all mothers are working, they can still pursue their passion. What is it that gives them life? What is it that makes them feel a joy? Yeah, and I agree that there is a resentment that we start to build towards children if you're not able to fulfill your own needs. And so, yes, 100% agree with that. And I think it's an interesting thing to see children come into the world with such a connection to their intuition, such a connection. That's all they really know is intuition at the very beginning. And you talk a little bit about how for many fire starters, it's those who can still hear their intuition or who can reclaim their intuition. And so do you think that we somehow, not only society, but sometimes as parents, we inadvertently extinguish fires.
I do. I mean, look, there are two things. One is that I talk about in the book false fires. So we've already talked about purpose, this idea that there's something that you're born to do and you can spend your whole life trying to figure it out and maybe never do, right? So that's why I think this is more about fulfillment. The other false fire is happiness, this idea that we're supposed to be always happy, and if it's not making us happy, then we're not doing the right thing. I think happiness has become like self-care, it's commoditized. And then busyness, and I'm guilty of this as anyone. You know, we start to fill our days and we become so focused on being productive that we don't focus on slowing down and listening to our intuition and what we want. And the other piece of this is, you said parental expectations. I interview a lot of women in the book, and it's funny because a lot of them are immigrants or they are children of immigrants who said, you will be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And they go way far down that path, and then they realize, I have spent a lot of time fulfilling this desire of my parents that it's not belonged to me. And I feel like I've now wasted that time. And how do I get back to being the person that I am meant to be?
Yeah. So a return to something that they had initially. Yeah, exactly. So in this book, you're not only focused on what people, but women very specifically, can do just to change things. And I love that because so often I think we're told as women, you just have to do something differently. If you feel like you're not reaching your full potential, or you feel like you're coming up against barriers, lean in, do better, try harder. And that's not what this book is offering us. There is, of course, a self-reflection. There is, let's kind of have a shift in our mindsets and how we see ourselves and think about how these barriers are systemic. But you also comment on the need for there to be cultural shifts, national shifts. And so before we open for audience Q&A, which we're going to do in a couple of minutes, my last question for you is, what are some of these national shifts that have to take place so that people know this is not only a book about self-help, it's also how do we become better at analyzing what we need on a national level and what we need to demand?
Yeah. I think it is local, and once you understand what is local, then you can start to focus on the national. I mean, what the world needs now more than ever are for women to bring their abilities, desires, and values to the table. As the saying goes, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, right? And women are on the menu right now in this country. So I think the first step is, and the book walks people through, what are my abilities? We underplay those often as women. So listing your abilities and having other people comment on what they think your abilities are and keeping that front and center to remind you, what are my values? There's so many of them and they change throughout your life. What are my desires? I don't think a lot of us are in touch with what those are. But I also think there's something to be said about coming together in community. And what is so exciting about this book so far is two things. One, there's something called Firestarter University. So if you buy the book, you can enroll for free. And over 700 women have enrolled so far. It's a free online program that's going to start in September. And many women from the book and other people, Jessica Yellen is going to kick it off. I'm so excited to go through this year-long program with these women because we can start to figure out what issues are and how to solve them. And then the other piece of this is something called bonfires. And so that's what I call the chapter in the book. But women are starting to take the book and create real life community groups where they can talk about personal, professional, and political empowerment. And I do think that is what's missing post-pandemic, given the polarization in this country, given social media. It is so important for us to come together, as my kids say, IRL, and to have these conversations about what the issues are and what we need to do to solve them. Not just gun safety, but there are so many issues that we need to fix, and I don't think we can do it until we start to come together.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. This is our first audience question. You warn against the capitalist narrative that urges women to monetize every passion. How do you distinguish between whether something is worth pursuing for maintaining a fire versus falling into the trap of achievement obsession?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole part in the book about this. There's a very funny riff from Elizabeth Gilbert where she's like, purpose. First you find your purpose. Then you have to make money from your purpose. Then other people have to make money from your purpose. And it just goes on and on and on. I think it is fine if you ultimately have something that you find fulfilling and that leads to, a career or income. But that shouldn't be the first priority. You know, you say, oh, I love baking, and suddenly you're thinking about opening a bakery. And I think we all fall into that trap. It's important to try things that we love just because we love them. And a lot of us don't carve out enough time for ourselves to do that.
Well, why is it you think that, I mean, I keep getting this question a lot around patriarchy and capitalism. Is it capitalism first, or is it patriarchy first, or whatever it is?
But what's the answer to that?
I mean, I say patriarchy first, and that capitalism is just used as a tool to advance that. But I'm curious, with the capitalist mentality that sometimes we all find ourselves wanting to be a part of, why is that? How does that sometimes keep us from actually fulfilling our real purpose? And you spoke about that, but what is it about the money aspect that we often are confused by that makes us think that that's what we should be?
Yeah, it's such a double-edged sword. I mean, on one hand, we start to commodify everything, right? From self-care to purpose to other things. And so they become sort of meaningless because they become about generating revenue and not about our own personal individual desire. And it can distort it, it can exploit it. But also, as I talk about in the book, women pay a passion tax. You know, I didn't take any pay for 11 years for what I did. And I talk about how I sort of martyred myself. You know, I thought I was a good girl because I wasn't a lobbyist. And yet other people in the organization were making money and making a living doing what they did. And so I do think, you know, I'm not sure I have all the answers to that because it can be difficult needle to thread. But if this is your desire, I think the bottom line is it doesn't have to lead to a career or income.
Yeah. But also to ask for it when you deserve money. Okay. What is your next fire after building a national movement?
Definitely, I mentioned Firestarter University and the bonfires. I think that'll be something that I focus on. I get asked the question a lot, will I run for office? I just moved, this is a strange transition, but I just moved from California to Florida, which is not what a lot of people do. But for my husband's job, we moved to Florida about a month ago, and I'm already getting involved in the political landscape there. I love being a blue dot in a red state. This is the 10th state I've lived in, many of them red. I think it's wonderful living in a state like California where you're making good laws and the rest of the country follows your lead. But there's also something really exciting to me about being in a really difficult state and making progress. And I get asked, will I run for office? And I always say never.
Oh, exciting. In Florida, of all places, this could be great for all of us. Okay. You write that your fire begins where all your shoulds end. What were some of the most unexpected shoulds you had to extinguish in your own life?
I think one of the most important was that I should stay married. You know, I got married right out of college to a college sweetheart during my parents' divorce, which I talk about in the book. But, you know, I come from a very Catholic family, and divorce is verboten. And I did not want to stay in this marriage the rest of my life. And there were a lot of people who had a lot of opinions about that. And that was a really difficult thing to overcome, was this idea that I didn't have to feel guilty about getting out of a bad relationship, as long as we could maintain a co-parenting relationship. This idea that I should continue to rise in the ranks of being a corporate communications executive, I stepped away from that and kind of experimented and did other things instead to see what I really love doing. And I think also, you know, women weren't seen as activists who got involved in gun safety. You know, that I should sort of stay on the sidelines and be quiet and let the men take care of what the issues were. There were plenty of think tanks run by men. There were plenty of state and city organizations run by men. And so to take on a leadership role as a woman, you know, even from the most supportive people, was sometimes not dealt with. They weren't happy about it. Yeah.
I want to piggyback off that with thinking about what you brought to the work that the men who had been in the work for a little longer didn't.
Creativity. I mean, I think there were a lot of people who were entrenched in, we make policy and we're very wonky and, you know, we're going to be very didactic in how we approach gun safety. And what it really, I thought, needed was a jolt. You know, we were out there doing creative projects with kids. We did a stroller jam at the Capitol where we drove across the lawn with our kids. Even our red shirts where we would show up at state houses and at the Capitol, and either men would be very excited to see us or very scared. I really think it needed this grassroots component. And I want you to answer this too, because women have always been the secret sauce of activism, right? The first time women, namely white women, were allowed to get involved in activism in this country was during Prohibition, because temperance was seen as a Christian value, and really men could never put that toothpaste back in the tube. And suffrage and civil rights and all the way up to the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, it's been women.
Yeah.
And you write a lot about this.
Thank you. I keep telling her not to bring it back to me. I tell her this is all about her today. But yes, I completely agree. I think we've always been part of these fights, even if we weren't getting the credit for it, even if we weren't getting the recognition or being seen as the faces of it. Women have always been the ones who have been maintaining the work. And so I think even in that comment that you were receiving, this is mostly men's work. That's not actually the case. It's just that men were being recognized more for it. And you changed the face of that.
Yeah, and the other thing I will say that I thought was interesting is, you would even, and I touched on this a little bit, but there was even blowback among progressive men who didn't love that we had created this incredibly powerful grassroots movement and we weren't deploying it the way they wanted to. I can't tell you how many issues, there were senators who were like, put your red shirts on for the environment or put them on, and to stay very focused singularly on one issue was important to me.
Yeah.
And so, there were times that you would have to have sharp elbows.
Okay. How does spirituality inform your work and the teachings in your book? Is living on purpose your spiritual practice?
I would not say living on fire is a spiritual practice. What I would say is, as I mentioned, I was raised in a very strict Catholic family. My dad entered the seminary at age 13 and was there for 10 years. And I went through Catholic school and, religious class every week and Mass every Sunday. And it just never fit for me. And it never felt, I never felt comfortable in the Catholic Church. And it was really when I started reading about Buddhism and learning about Buddhism, and I'm laughing because my dad believes yoga was the gateway to Buddhism for me. But, to me, when I stumbled upon mostly Western teachings of the Buddhist faith, it clicked. This is a manual for living a life with the least amount of suffering possible, right speech, right action. And I think I began to see Moms Demand Action and my leadership of it as a Buddhist practice. So a big part of Buddhist practice is managing your ego. And so when I was talking about power being finite or how I led people, that has all been, I think, part of my Buddhist faith. So that to me has been my spirituality.
So there's a combination of the two. You've said that anger, especially in women, can be a transformative force rather than a destructive one. How can women harness their anger in a constructive way?
I think everyone has a go-to emotion. Mine is anger. It always has been my whole life. And, anger can be very detrimental. It can be something that you turn on yourself or other people. Or if it's righteous, it can be something that helps people. I do think women, we know this for a fact, that women are often encouraged to tamp out their anger, to play it down, and to not act angry, particularly Black women. And that's because it's dangerous in a good way. Women's anger leads to revolutions.
Yeah.
And I think activism is all based in anger and righteous anger. And that is a powerful emotion to fuel people. I mean, again, I'm not a gun violence survivor. The vast majority of the volunteers in Moms Demand Action are not gun violence survivors. They are simply angry or afraid, and that fear turns into anger, right? They're outraged that no one is acting to protect people. So I think we should lean into our anger. Soraya Chomly, a feminist author, wrote the book Rage Becomes Her. Moms Demand Action is featured in it. And she just talks about the benefits of women's anger and how if we were more in touch with it and we were able to channel it, we would see systematic change in this country.
Yeah. Another one of my favorites is Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper. Because we've been told since we were little girls, anger is not one of the choices that you have.
Yep.
But we have seen that again. It's sort of how we've analyzed history incorrectly by saying that women haven't been angry. We've been angry. We're going to continue to be angry until we see these changes. The Democratic Party's favorability ratings are at record lows. What advice do you have for party leaders right now?
Step aside.
Yeah, we can clap for that.
I think a couple things. We talked about hoarding power, and we are seeing so many examples of that. There's so many excellent lawmakers who did amazing things who have overstayed their welcome, and mostly men. And we need those. We need people to be more self-aware and to see this as service and not as a career or something that is, just to feed their own egos. And how these people aren't able to look at themselves and see that they are actually now causing real damage and real harm to the party. So look, I think people should be primaried. The place where I want to be careful is ageism, because I want people to be encouraged to run for office at all ages. There are plenty, the average age for a woman to run in this country is 47. And that is because most often they feel like they can't run until they've had a career and a family. And if we say that you have to, if your limit is 65, then that's sort of an artificial marker to me. There are plenty of brilliant people in their 70s, 80s, and beyond.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But that is not the same as getting in office at 25 and staying until you're 95. That is a very different thing. And so I think there's a nuance there that we keep missing.
Yeah, absolutely.
But look, I think just as some people are too old to serve, some people are too young to serve, it all depends on the purpose, the person. But we have to, as a party, learn from our mistakes. We are in a different world where the talking points and the behaviors of politicians from 2000 and before just are not going to work.
Yeah. What would you say we need to focus most on if you could choose one thing that we need to shift towards right now?
I think we need to elect more women to office.
Absolutely. Such a simple solution, You mentioned how coalitions will dismantle systems, not a single individual. How do you recommend women build their fire starter teams in a world that often teaches us to compete with rather than lift up other women?
Yeah, it's this scarcity mindset, right? Because people talk about imposter syndrome. I don't think imposter syndrome is a real thing. When you are one of the first people to do something, of course you have this feeling of like, I don't belong here. And that's often where women are. And so there's this scarcity mindset. If someone gets to do something, then someone isn't going to get to do something because there aren't many people who have done it before. And maybe as we see more women in office, as only 1% of Fortune 1000 CEOs are women, as we see more women, I think women outnumber men in college by far now. So women are going to be in more positions of power. Maybe once we see that scarcity mindset and that competition will go away. And there's also a difference, I think, between the way Black women build community and the way white women build community. And we've talked about this before, too, which is Black women have built community for survival, and they understand how to do it. And women have often clung to the power of white men. As Brittany Packnett Cunningham often says, your whiteness will not save you from what the patriarchy has in store for you, right? And so the more that we are able to build community, I think bonfires, as I talked about, is one potential idea for a solution. But building those communities and creating people around you who are mentors, and friendship is difficult, particularly in midlife. And so it is about being vulnerable and going at this on purpose. That is really the key. I don't think anyone can live on fire on their own.
Yeah, that's so important. And with that in mind, who are some of the leaders that you lean on or consider yourself as being a colleague in this work with, and folks that we can be really inspired by right now? Who are some of those people that maybe didn't make it into the book, but that we could all go look up after this and experience that hope
Oh, gosh. So many women. I was just with Sally Christensen, who's the CEO of Argent. I'm wearing an Argent suit. She has built a whole clothing company around supporting women's activism. So if you don't follow Argent, you should do that. There are so many up-and-coming lawmakers who I'm really excited about, who are running for governor all over the country that we should make sure that we're supporting. Annie Andrews is running against Lindsey Graham. She's a pediatrician in South Carolina. If you don't know who that is, please look her up. Oh gosh, there's so many women out there who are doing such amazing things.
Yeah, those are great ones to start with. Given the polarization in this country, how do we speak up against human rights abuses in Gaza and other places and demand action without giving into fear of being ostracized? I didn't realize there was a second break.
Anytime you're on the right side of an issue, you have to stand up for it. And this is about enduring the blowback. I mean, I really do think that is the lesson of in activism. If you are on the right side of history, or you believe you are on the right side of history, and you feel passionately about something, as I said, it's all predictable. None of it is personal. Keep going.
I love that we can clap for that. Oh, one more. Okay, two more. And these will be, we'll have just enough time to finish everybody's questions. What do you wish someone had told you when you first began to light the match?
I'm glad no one told me what it was in for. Honestly, I do. I think they say there's a fine line between stupidity and naivete. I'm so grateful I straddled that line because, it was much more difficult than I imagined, and I had a great idea and it came to fruition, and I'm so grateful for that. And I'm glad for all the lessons I learned, but I'm also glad I went into it with an open mind. I do think having kind of that open mindset is really important so that you can learn and that you can grow and that you can look back at what you endured and not sort of dread what's coming. But I'm incredibly grateful for all of the challenges. I think I would tell myself that, activism is a delicate balance between top down and bottom up. You need enough top down to have control, but you need enough top down so that there's not chaos, but you need enough bottom up so there's not too much control. Does that make sense? Like this is delicate balance and a dance all the time. And I do wish I had known that more.
The balance a little bit. But I feel like that goes along with what you were saying with not needing to dot all the I's or cross all the T's, not needing to know exactly what it was going to look like, but just starting.
Just starting.
Which I love. This is the final question. I'm concerned about the state of our democracy.
Statement.
Who is not? Yeah. What are a few things that I can do? We all want to know. That's a perfect one to end with.
Yes. I just wrote a whole Substack about this. If you've rallied in March, now what comes next? And so definitely check that out. What I have seen in my activism is that often cynicism is an excuse for inaction. Hopelessness or helplessness is a decision. Just like as Miriam Kambe, who says, hope is a discipline. You sort of have to wake up every day and decide to be hopeful and decide to act. And no action is too small. Incrementalism has become such a dirty word in activism, and particularly among young people, which I get. The role of younger people is to push against older people and demand change quickly. But at the same time, the system is not set up that way. And, we have to accept that we are in the long game. Suffrage, for example, took 100 years. Many of the women who were starved and beaten and imprisoned never saw the fruits of their labor, and yet they laid the foundation for all women to have the right to vote. And so we may not see the work that we're doing happen in our lifetime. That doesn't mean it's hopeless. It just means we're part of a democracy. And democracy is kind of like a sick kid. When your kid is sick at 3 a.m. and they've been throwing up on you all night, you don't look at them and say, wow, you are really sick, but I am really tired, and I will catch you, in the morning and see how that's going. You hold their hand until they're better. And I do think democracy is like a sick child, and all of us have to get off the sidelines and use our abilities, our values, and our desires to make it better.
I love that mothering metaphor. That was so great. We are all going to remember that, the sick child of democracy. Shannon, I can't thank you enough. This was so incredibly inspiring. I know that this book is undoubtedly going to create even more movements across our nation, across this world, and I'm just so grateful that you're willing to come to San Francisco, be here with all of us, and I was just honored to be in conversation with you. So let's give a round of applause
Thank you,
to
Anna. For Anna,
Shannon
too.
Watts.
Thank you, Anna.
So awesome. And thank you to our audience, both in person and those who were tuning in virtually. Make sure to get your copy of this instant New York Times bestseller, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. Shannon is going to be here signing books outside the lobby right after the program. And for more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. Once again, I'm Dr. Anna Malika Tubbs, and I am so grateful to you all for showing up tonight. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.